Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're popping the hood on a system that, honestly, most of us think we understand perfectly, and that is charity. But I'm going to ask you to totally suspend your baseline assumptions for a few minutes about how modern philanthropy actually works. We're going to dig into a really groundbreaking paper by Roshan Gadamian, and it completely challenges the very financial foundations of how we fund doing good in the world.
Let's kick things off with a question that might ruffle a few feathers. Why does philanthropy literally always seem to run out of money? Think about it for a second. We have these massive, ongoing financial investments pouring in from foundations and donors all over the globe, yet the philanthropic sector is just constantly operating from a place of scarcity. We hear it all the time, right? There simply isn't enough capital to solve our biggest social problems. But what if the problem isn't the amount of money at all, but rather the actual mathematical structure of how that money is deployed?
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at philanthropy's favorite tool, the grant. As Roshan Gadamian points out in our source material, the grant is so thoroughly the default that it has become invisible as a structure. It is the water the sector swims in. We are so incredibly used to the idea of a grant that we completely forget it's just a financial design choice. It's not some unalterable law of physics. It's a man-made instrument.
So the crucial thing here is how we define this tool. If we look at the grant through a strict, cold financial lens, it's what Gadamian calls single-use capital. Basically, this means it's capital that funds an activity exactly once, is entirely consumed in the doing of that activity, and is never returned. It is the exact financial equivalent of a single-use plastic water bottle. You use it once and then you toss it out. Whether the funded project crashes and burns or succeeds wildly, the money does its job one time and then it permanently leaves the philanthropic system.
Now, contrast that with how things like debt and equity work. In those structures, capital is recycled, it's returned, or it's transformed into a new asset that can be deployed all over again. But with grants, the capital is completely severed, and it produces a literal zero financial return to the funder. And listen, this isn't about whether a funder is a generous saint or some greedy lender. Not at all. It is entirely a matter of structural math. The grant mechanism is explicitly designed to fail to recycle capital.
And because of this structural math, the philanthropic sector falls into three massive endemic traps. We've got value leakage, dependency by design, and the deployment once horizon. Let's walk through each of these.
Trap number 1, value leakage.
Here's the truly deep irony about value leakage. It happens precisely when grants are performing at their absolute best. It's this wild phenomenon called the paradox of success. So imagine a foundation funds a brilliant program, and it explodes into a huge self-sustaining franchise. Or maybe they fund research that creates incredibly valuable patentable software. Well, that generated value, all that surplus revenue and intellectual property, it just leaks right out into the surrounding commercial economy. It doesn't come back to replenish the philanthropic pool that birthed it in the first place. So literally, the better the grant works at creating lasting value, the more value escapes the system forever.
Moving on to the second trap, dependency by design. We love to point fingers at nonprofits, right? We blame them for being overly reliant on donors, but the source material totally shifts this blame away from the organizations and places it squarely on the grant's architecture. Under a single-use structure, success simply does not equal independence. Think about it. Because a grant leaves behind zero returnable surplus and no equity stake for the organization to draw against, even a flawlessly performing nonprofit hits the end of their grant cycle, mathematically requiring another grant just to keep the lights on. The instrument structurally rewards asking for renewals over actually achieving self-sufficiency, all because it lacks any mechanism to convert great performance into financial autonomy.
And that brings us to the third failure mode, the deployment once horizon.
This right here is the quantitative beating heart of today's explainer. It's how single-use capital places a hard, undeniable ceiling on the amount of social good we can create. In finance, velocity is the rate at which a dollar is redeployed. Because a granted dollar is never, ever redeployed, its velocity is exactly 1, which means the total social output of any philanthropic fund is strictly capped by whatever the initial size of its bank account was.
Let's do a super simple thought experiment. Say you have $100. In a traditional grant structure, $100 buys exactly $100 of social activity, and that's the end of the story. But if you use a structure that recovers even a highly conservative 50% of its deployments, meaning $50 comes back, and then you redeploy that, and $25 comes back, and so on, that identical $100 actually produces $200 of social value over its lifetime. By simply changing the instrument to allow for recycling, you literally double your impact without having to raise a single extra cent.
So you are probably wondering,
Why haven't we fixed this yet? Well, that brings us to what's called the reform illusion. Fresh paint, same architecture.
If you look at the last 20 years, philanthropy has pushed all these big reforms, right? Multi-year funding, unrestricted funding, trust-based models. And don't get me wrong, extending time horizons and building trust drastically improve the recipient's experience. They are deeply, deeply humane adjustments. But structurally, none of them touch the return side of the ledger. They leave the core architecture totally intact. It's essentially just a kinder, gentler way to spend a dollar exactly one time.
Now, to be fair, let's look at the exceptions, when single use is the perfect choice.
To maintain our analytical credibility here, we absolutely must acknowledge that grants aren't always bad. There are 3 very specific scenarios where they are the absolute perfect tool for the job. First is emergency relief, things like famine or disaster response. Speed is literally everything there, and you aren't exactly looking for a financial return on averted suffering. Second, pure public goods. Think basic scientific research or preserving an endangered language where trying to capture a return would unjustly privatize something that belongs to all of us. And third, dignity transfers, like direct cash given to people living in poverty. If you introduced a recovery mechanism to a dignity transfer, you would instantly corrupt an act of solidarity into a burdensome loan, which defeats the whole point.
What ties those 3 exceptions together is one unifying rule: the complete absence of recoverable value. The traditional grant is uniquely correct only when there is genuinely no returnable surplus that can be captured without corrupting the act itself.
Which leads us to where we go from here, the regenerative future, unleashing capital velocity.
Those exceptions are important, but they do not represent the vast majority of what philanthropy actually funds today. For the massive chunk of efforts that actually do build self-sustaining value, we need a real structural solution. We need regenerative capital theory and something called recoverable grants. These instruments act a lot like a traditional grant by avoiding extractive, punishing interest rates, but they are specially built to capture surplus when an organization succeeds. They actually convert a recipient's success into true financial independence. And most importantly, they multiply the lifetime output of the funder's capital by allowing that money to recycle back into the system.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. If your charitable dollars could work infinitely instead of just once, how would you redesign your giving? Once you start seeing that the single-use grant is a choice rather than some law of nature, a whole new world of regenerative impact just opens right up. I highly encourage you to reflect on this, question those baseline assumptions we all have, and seek out more information on regenerative systems. Thanks so much for joining me today on The Explainer, and I'll catch you next time.